Hi, I'm Amy Porter, and this is my podcast. My mission is to show people how to empower themselves through music, business, and media. I try to see as clearly as possible how I can help. I showcase the music that I've played and the people I've met along the way. I'm a wife and a stepmom. You might know me as a professor, a performer, a producer, a publisher, a recording artist. I'm the founder of a couple of nonprofits. Welcome in to my PorterFlute Pod. Welcome to PorterFlute Pod. I'm here with the audio portion of one of our Anatomy of Sound workshop lectures. It's one from Dr. David Dowling, professor of engineering here at the University of Michigan. His research covers a variety of topics in acoustics and fluid mechanics. He combines experimental, theoretical, and computational techniques. These projects are linked by the fact that fluid dynamics and acoustic waves in fluids both spring from the same conservation equations. Acoustics is the linear theory of fluid dynamics. Dr. Dowling's degrees include a PhD in aeronautics, a Master's of Science in Aeronautics, and a Bachelor of Science in Applied Physics, all from the California Institute of Technology. So with his expertise in underwater acoustics, hydrodynamics, hydro-acoustics, and structural acoustics, I sought him out to literally quantify my flute sound. If people wanted to sound like me, then we had to figure out scientifically what they needed to do. Do you want to follow along later with the video? Well, you can check it out on our Anatomy of Sound YouTube channel. In the pod with me, co-producers Alan J. Tomasetti and Jordan Smith. Thanks for being in PorterFlute Pod. I'm so happy you're here. In trying to bring a more quantifiable experience for our masterclass, I had a conversation with Dr. Brown about how we could quantify what we were seeing instead of qualify what we were seeing, and how we could, see our sound in an instant. And they sent us to the School of Engineering and asked me to contact David Dowling, who stands here today, thankfully, because it took 3 conversations with Dr. Dowling, probably a couple of emails as well, to convince him that he could actually do something for us. It wasn't that I wasn't being clear, it's that it was so fascinating to him that flute players would want to see their sound in an instant. I mean, why? Well, for us, there's so many reasons. There's beginner sound, there's professional sound, there's your sound, there's my sound, there's the variable of the anatomy. So how can we, and David Brown flat out wants to sound like Amy Porter. I don't know why, but he says, everybody wants your sound, and we want to see it. We want to know what it looks like. So I called Dr. Dowling. Now I'm going to ask Dr. Dowling to take over because he asked me questions. And Dr. Brown said, he warned me, he knows me, he knows I'm a free spirit. He's like, now Amy, you have to get your words together and describe everything perfectly. I couldn't get all frou-frou, because we're here to get rid of our frou-frou vocabulary. So Dr. Dowling, please welcome him first of all. And his assistant, Tyler. Okay, so talk to us about why you were questioning, first of all, up me. Are you sure?
My impression was that music was such a personal and emotional experience. Why would you want this stuff I'm about to show you? It's probably pretty much different than anything else you've seen. So, a piece of music, the score goes on and on and on, many lines. Okay. We'll be talking about one note. Okay? Even within one note, okay, there's an awful lot of stuff that goes into making your sound. Okay? So the basic idea here is that I'm not a musician, but I've spent the better part of my career analyzing sound for the Navy and the auto companies in order to extract information. So in a certain sense, you're doing kind of the same thing. You're making sound for the purposes music and musical entertainment and your own enjoyment. Okay, so in both cases, we're doing sound for a purpose. The fact is that I want to essentially get to. Let me go back. I want to get to the idea that there's at least two ways to display sound in a quantitative manner. Okay, so if we just jump right in, okay, there's the typical way, and you've probably seen this. We have acoustic pressure versus time. So just a little notional thing. So here's an evolving waveform which goes on in time. Now this is the way we hear sound. This is the way it's recorded. This is commonly the way it's displayed. However, when it's analyzed, okay, particularly for the things that I do, it's almost always some kind of acoustic amplitude versus frequency. So that we would have essentially some set of peaks where we essentially are increasing in frequency from one side to the other. And even though there's a bunch of peaks there, and that might be complicated, that might still be one note. Okay? So the nice thing about it is that if you're interested in this, you can get it. If you're interested in this, you can get it, because modern technology on your smartphone, for 20 bucks, you can have audio tools, which was what we're going to show you here. Okay? So this is the kind of thing that is essentially accessible to everybody. And the potential benefits come from the fact that it's graphical and it's quantitative. And the sound that you record on Monday, you get the same picture for the whole rest of the week if you keep looking back at that sound. Whereas your own human acoustic memory on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, Thursday, you might have remembered that sound differently. So understanding and using both representations, of course, may be beneficial for the production of music. So here's the motivation that I know about. Some of the things that we talk about today are similar to some of the things that I've done for automobiles. First off, some things about human acoustic perception, okay, which is essentially the point of delivery for music, obviously. So one of its problems, it's illusory and imperfectly repeatable. So memories fade and are dependent on time of day, level of interest, distraction, etc. That if I have a teenage son, and it's quite clear that his human acoustic perception goes to 0 when I'm talking to him, because he just doesn't want to hear it. Second thing is, it's not quantitative. Even if you hear the sound and you hear it well, it's not immediately numbers. And if you wanted to communicate your experience factually to somebody else, it's not easy to do. You wind up with qualifiers and descriptions. It's subjective. I listen to the sound. My wife listens to the sound. My oldest daughter listens to the sound. My oldest son listens. It's all, everybody's going to say something slightly different about it. And then as mentioned, the findings are not easily visualized. So if we're going to, essentially, in some sense, this is the gold standard, though. This is people decide whether they like music or not based on the perception. They couldn't care less about what it looks like. If we jump to the acoustic analysis realm, we solve a lot of these. It becomes precise and repeatable. Okay? It's quantitative. We directly get numbers from the recordings. It is no longer subjective. The same recording done here will be the same quantitative stuff if listened to in Europe or Africa or South America or Asia. It doesn't matter. Your cultural background will not influence things. It's no longer subjective. And then the findings can be visualized and plotted. So that's what we'll be getting to. So the goal of this presentation is to explain and then demonstrate readily available acoustic analysis tools that can be used to augment what you're already doing. Okay? So. In order to push forward with this, what I want to do is essentially start off with simple acoustic, auditory, and visual examples using pure tone sounds. Now, for me, the pure tone sound is the building block of all the other sounds. And then, of course, you then take a bunch of pure tone sounds, you build it into a musical note, then you take the musical note, you put it together with a bunch of other notes, then you take that and put it together with a bunch of other instruments, and now you've got music, okay? So we're way down here in terms of the basic stuff. So the pure tone sound is the simplest sound, okay? And it has a simple oscillatory pattern in time. Now, they're very, very easy to make synthetically. The problem is that although they might have high clarity, they're artificial, weak, uninspiring. They're no fun, okay? So if you bear with me for the next few minutes, we'll be going through pure tone sounds, and then eventually we're going to get to stuff that's more fun and more interesting, sort of warmer and richer and much more musical. But if we can get through pure tones, music is the sum of many pure tones all occurring at the same time. So if we start with the building blocks and then put them on top of each other, eventually we can erect a nice castle. So, starting with visualizing sound as acoustic pressure versus time. And this is what you probably have seen already, okay? So the basic idea here, and I think we got the levels set. That's A440, a single note. Now because it's just a single sine wave, it's not particularly fun or interesting. So in this case, a pure tone is entirely described by an amplitude, which is the word that I'm going to use in engineering, which replaces either loudness or musical volume, essentially how much sound there is. Then it's also described by a frequency, in this case 440 hertz, which is what you probably would call pitch or tone or even note. So if I play this sound again, it's providing this kind of pressure pattern. Now this horizontal axis is time in milliseconds. Now everybody knows that you say 1,000 and that's a second. Now if you somehow back that up, you broke that into 1,000 pieces, then you'd have milliseconds. So this actually represents a very short period of time, 5 milliseconds. This vertical axis, which I've listed as acoustic pressure, okay, goes from essentially, this is pressures above atmospheric, these are pressures below atmospheric. However, this axis is pathetic compared to atmospheric pressure. It's about 1 part in a million for ordinary sounds. So one of the ways to think about this, because I realize you're musicians, okay? You probably didn't just come out of a math class to get here, okay? So if you wanted to think about essentially acoustic pressure versus time in a simpler way, just remember the clock goes on the horizontal axis. Down below the axis you have vacuum, which is it's less than, acoustic pressure is less than atmospheric, and above you've got overpressure. Now I realize both of these devices make sound. Don't think of the sound here. This is the vacuum is meant it's low pressure, this is high pressure. Now for A440, if I counted these peaks in 1 second, I'd get 440 of them. So it's actually a lot of oscillations in a time period compared to what we ordinarily would want to count, certainly. So now let's explore this idea of amplitude and frequency by again listening to pure tones. So here I've got again time in milliseconds, acoustic pressure, and I've got 3 sounds, all which are the same note or the same tone. Okay? So we'll listen to this one, and this one. Now if you're listening carefully, you would know it got a little bit louder. However, in reality, this is a full factor of 2. So what we can determine from this is that as human listeners, if we're careful, we can sense amplitude changes. But we have to think about it. Okay? And if you close your eyes, it sounds, at least to me, this sounds a little bit like the sound source is coming closer. Okay? Because sound levels tend to decrease with distance away from the source. So the main thing to note here is that the amplitude goes up. These are 3 different sounds. So we can determine amplitude if we pay attention. Now let's talk about the second thing that makes up the pure tone is the frequency. Now the frequency is determined essentially either as the distance between the peaks or between essentially all the upward zero crossings. So here's the A440 that we just listened to. And these are now 3 tones, which is essentially times 1, times 2, and times 3. And now it's obvious. You don't have to try. You know they're all different. Okay? So as a human listener, we're on pitch, we're on it. Okay? You don't have to be, essentially, you have to make any special effort. You'll determine the changes in pitch. So these are the ways, essentially, that we can visualize sound as acoustic pressure versus time. Now there's another way to do this, okay? We can visualize sound as acoustic amplitude versus frequency. So here's the equivalent picture to what I had just a few moments ago. So this is A440. Except now, I've got acoustic amplitude on the vertical axis, and I've got frequencies on the horizontal axis. Going from 0 here, oops, there's 500 hertz, so A440 is right here at 440 hertz. And then it runs out to 0. Now, the method for taking essentially an acoustic recording, which always comes to us as pressure versus time, and switching it, okay, is this guy Fourier. He was a French mathematician and physicist who lived between 1768 and 1830. And he figured out that we can not only display things as acoustic pressure versus time, but as acoustic amplitude versus frequency. So this plot down here is essentially Fourier's intellectual work, which we now benefit from enormously. So if you wanted to think about this in essentially a simpler way again, since I realize you're not mathematicians and I don't want you to try to be, you're musicians, you can think of this horizontal axis like the set of piano keys. If you ever sit at the piano, the low notes are over here and the high notes are over here. So as I move from left to right, I'm essentially increasing the pitch or the frequency. Then the vertical axis, the quiet stuff is down here, everybody's sleeping, and then the loud stuff is up here. So what this plot tells us is that we've got essentially no sound except at this one frequency where it's fairly loud, and then there's nothing else. So this is the representation for a pure tone. So in a few minutes I'll be showing you other things which have peaks. So we'll note that where the peaks are, that's where the sound frequencies are. So here's that same thing with the amplitude change, now shown as acoustic amplitude versus frequency. So I've got, that's 2 factors of 2 in amplitude. Here's the same representation now with changing the frequency but keeping the amplitude the same. So the shift in the peak from left to right is I'm running the pitch up. So now let's get away from the completely plastic sounds and start putting them together. So let's combine some pure tones, and I'll show you this first as acoustic pressure versus time, and then acoustic amplitude versus frequency. So we'll start with what you've already heard, at least a couple times, acoustic pressure versus time for A440. Now I'm going to add to it essentially the same note, but from the next higher octave, and I'm going to put it in at half the amplitude. So that sounds like, you put it together, finally, it's more interesting. Now, because of, there's not one up here, but because of the physical structure of the flute, you will intend to make what I would call the fundamental frequency. And then the instrument itself, naturally, with your cooperation, produces sets of tones which are integer multiples of the first one. So even though this sounds, obviously it's more complicated, this would still be something that you could that would essentially come from a single note on a single instrument, because it's, now you can see the black curve here is the sum of the two. So if this is a sine wave and this is a sine wave, now we're getting something that's a funnier shape. So let's add another one. So here's what we just had. And now I'm going to add in the times 3 frequency, but even at a slightly lower amplitude. You put those together and you get, okay? Now, it's not music yet, but it's starting to sound a little bit like a harmonica, okay? And that comes from adding the tones in. So when you're playing the flute, anybody have an idea how many tones you're getting? Okay, I'll show you. It's at least 11. Okay, I cut the plots off at 11, but they keep going beyond that. So let's add one more in. So here's the 3 tones. We'll add in a 6. And then put these together and we get, so it's becoming sort of a real sound, okay? And it comes from adding the pure tones. Now this is in the, what I would say in the time domain, where I've got time on this axis, so I get this funny looking waveform, okay? We can learn something from that, but I cannot see what frequencies are there. But if I look down below, now I've got the acoustic amplitude versus frequency. Now I can see exactly what I've got. I'm thinking of this lower plot as being the anatomy of that sound. Okay? And that if we were going to be doing, let's say, the identification of a distant submarine, which was from a foreign entity that we wanted to track, that's the kind of stuff they're looking at. Okay? They're looking for that kind of acoustic signature. Now, this is not, in a certain sense, just knowing the frequencies is not enough. Because as human beings, we still have a little sensitivity to amplitude. So let me show you that. So on this plot, I've got this sum of 4 tones, just like we had before. And that's where the lowest frequency is the loudest, and they get quieter. Then I've got this one down here, where they're all the same amplitude. And if you play these back to back, the second one's buzzier. The second's not as warm. Okay. To me, it's just plain different. So if I then, well, if I look here at the black curve, and I look here at the black curve, I might have trouble discovering what's happening. But if I look here, the frequency on the horizontal axis, frequency of pitch. Remember, you can think of this as a piano keyboard. And acoustic amplitude. Here I can see the tones decreasing. Here I can see they're all the same. Okay? By producing this, okay, now you have essentially a key to unlocking where essentially your timbre is coming from. So, Tyler put this together. We don't always have to go in integer multiples. The flute does it naturally, but we don't always have to. So we put this together. So this is a guitar chord. And if we ask Fourier what we should see, we get this. And we say, here's the 440. And then I think this is this 5 quarters?
C#5.
Okay, anyway, and then, so these others then give that more complicated sound. Now that's all artificial. Let's not get to the meat of the problem. So here's a flute. So that's one note, A440, played on a flute. And you can see up here, this is acoustic pressure, and here's time. It's a nearly repetitive waveform. There's a little bit of vibrato that you could hear. It's not perfectly steady, but it's quite close. That appears as acoustic amplitude versus frequency like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and we could probably keep going. However, this, from here to here, is a change of 40 decibels, which is considerable. So the peaks that are out here, they're adding some to the character of the sound, but they're not going to be as important. So that's what you get by trying to make A440. You're actually doing all of these. Okay? And when they're done correctly, these are all integer multiples of that original frequency. And the instrument itself is making essentially all of this complexity. Okay? Now, you as the player have some control over this. How hard you blow, how big of an opening you blow through, how you hit the mouthpiece, okay? And that then leads to different heights of these peaks, and to a certain extent, some alignment of these higher tones. So essentially what this lower plot is showing is the anatomy of that flute sound, is that you've got at least 11 frequencies in it, okay, with some other stuff filling in between. So before we get to, I've got a few more things to show you. And sort of like the intellectual summary here then is that sound can be visualized as acoustic pressure versus time and as acoustic amplitude versus frequency. And the second one is what I'm thinking of as the anatomy of a sound. Not human anatomy, not anatomy of the instrument, but anatomy of the sound. Such visualizations can quantitatively indicate the character, signature, timbre of musical sounds. And these concepts can be applied in musical instruction and learning via readily available and relatively inexpensive smartphone apps. Now the technician just showed me another one. These are the ones that I knew about. There's Audacity, Spectrum, Viewchrome. Audio Tools is the one we'll be demonstrating here in just a minute. $20. Okay? So let me show you some of the output from it first. Now before I do that, I want to tell you that I don't have any more listening examples, because Audio Tools is relatively simple. I get the spectrum, or I get the time domain waveform, but I can't get them both. Okay, at least for playback. So here is a sample. Now it comes up black. So this horizontal axis down here is time. Okay, these are the high pressures up here. These are the low pressures down here. And this is from about 3 weeks ago. Professor Porter was playing 14K white gold flute. And there's some really fun things that I can see here. Number one, it's really nice and it's almost perfectly periodic. And if you look at the waveform, essentially these dips almost all come down to exactly the same place. This set of jagged peaks here all come up to almost exactly the same spot. And this little feature here is consistent all the way through. Okay? Now, what this tells me is that this waveform is composed of multiple pure tones, and they're clean. They're not wiggling around. So the same day, student number 1. This is the same note, again, time, with acoustic pressure. And here you can see that although some of the peaks look about the same, if I look at this wiggle here, it's down right near the middle, it changes in amplitude as we go through. This one's going to have some vibrato in it. It's a good sound, but it's not quite as clean. Okay? Here's a second student. First thing you note, I think they were a little closer to the microphone because the amplitude has gone up and down. This one's louder. Okay? But if I look, there's just a little variation in the peaks. So this one's low, and one of these over here is sort of high. This is also a good sound. Now this was acoustic, pressure versus time. So with the same cell phone app, I can get pressure amplitude versus frequency. So here's frequencies down here. Remember, this is the piano keyboard. So we can think of The low notes are over here. This is a picture of a smoke alarm, so there's the high screechy stuff's over here. And this is Professor Porter. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 peaks again. And the things that I can note here is the peaks are narrow and they're actually quite tall, 35 to 40 decibels. They also progress nicely. First up, here's the fundamental, second harmonic, third harmonic, and then they come back down. They don't alternate, okay? Also, the tonal alignment is almost perfect. This one's at 440, and then the one that's at times 10 is up here at 4.4K. All right? So, these are the quiet sounds. These are the loud sounds. Here's the first student. So, this curve that's in rust, a little bit lower on the fundamental, higher on the second harmonic. Lower, higher, lower, the same, then all lower, and then we note a little bit of tonal misalignment here, and then perhaps noticeable tonal misalignment here. Okay? Look, I'm not a musical expert. I'm not a trained listener. You likely are. When I heard these two sounds in this room, they both sounded great. Okay? However, the musicians knew they were different. Okay? So here's the third student. This one's in blue. Again, okay, the blue up, and then I think it's down, down, up, down, up. Pattern is not smooth as in the amplitude of the peaks. However, if you look out here, the second student maintained the tonal the tonal alignment. Okay, so again, this is a good sound. Okay. Now there was also an amateur player that was recorded that day.
A complete beginner.
Okay, we will not say who this is. However, they did, because Professor Porter was holding the flute, the fundamental note is correct, but look at the second, third, and fourth peaks. They're much lower, and they are not cleanly resolved. They're not these great big tall spikes, okay? And then once you get out here, it's all sort of smeared out. If that player was to be instructed, use this cell phone app to make a better sound, then what you got to do is essentially work with the instrument in order to try to essentially get these to pluck up again, okay? So that if you have this, and you want to play a really nice A440, you just pull up Professor Porter's sound and then try to make yours look like hers, okay?
Thank you, Dr. Dowling, for allowing me to persist in asking you to quantify my sound. Again, if you want to actually see the graphs, head over to Anatomy of Sound YouTube channel. You can find our podcast transcriptions over at PorterFlute.com and find me at AmyPorterProductions.com as well as AmyPorter.com. Thanks for being in PorterFlute Pod. I'm so grateful for you.